this program, Words Like Freedom will feature Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi, author of A Girl is a Body of Water, and moderator Dr. Ainehi Edoro Glines, June 19th, 3 p.m. Available for purchase online from the Schomburg shop at schomburgshop.com is the featured book, A Girl is a Body of Water.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third annual Schomburg Center Literary Festival. I am Dr. Ainehi Edoro Glines, Assistant Professor of Global Black Literatures at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I teach African literature and digital culture. I am also the founder and editor of brittlepaper.com, an online literary magazine for readers of African literature. So today is Juneteenth, and for those of you who are logging on around the world, Juneteenth is an American holiday held on the 19th of June in celebration of the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. So as Juneteenth celebration happens all over the country, we are truly honored today to be able to talk about a book that presents a passionate and joyful exploration of women, of the lives of women fighting to be free. Today, I'm in conversation with Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi to discuss her second novel, A Girl is a Body of Water. Jennifer is a recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize. Her first novel, Chintu, won the Kwani Manuscript Project Prize in 2013 and was longlisted for the Etisalat Prize in 2014. Her short story, Let's Tell the Story Properly, was the winner of the 2014 Commonwealth Short Story Prize. Jennifer lives in Manchester, UK, with her husband and son. Her book, A Girl is a Body of Water, can be purchased using the link below or by going to schomburgshop.com. Also, thank you to our ASL interpreter and live captioner for joining us today. To find out more about the festival and other events, go to schomburgcenterlitfest.org. Jennifer, it's such a delight to have you here today. We're just going to jump right in. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and then go ahead and, share with us the passage that you've selected?
Thank you, Ainehi. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm glad to be here and to be invited to the Schomburg Festival. Now, A Girl is a Body of Water is about a little Ugandan girl growing up in a rural village in the 1970s, specifically 1975. And she's well loved by her grandparents, but she doesn't know who her mother is. And she imagines that if her grandparents love her that much, probably the mother would love her even more. But every time she asks the family, who is my mother? Where is she? They all say, we don't know, but she's somewhere. She will come, she loves you. At the same time, Chirabo has a problem that she flies out of her body and finds herself, skidding about over roofs, especially in moments of distress. And at one point, she gets these two aspects of her life, the absence of her mother and the flying out, and imagines that they are connected, that probably she's a witch, that probably her mother abandoned her because she's a witch. And so in that moment, when she's working herself up, she decides to visit the village witch to, first of all, to find out what is going on with her mother, but also to ask her to stop her from flying out of her body. But when she goes to the witch, or whom she imagines is a witch, the woman herself has other ideas for Chirao because she has noticed something interesting about her. And the part that I'm going to read is one of the conversations that Chirabo has with Witch, because The witch promises to find her mother, but she also tells her that you fly out of your body because the first woman, the very first woman on earth, is in her. And the witch thinks that Chirabo should keep that first woman in her, and so that we can see what she was like. So the part I'm going to read is when she explains why the first woman is in her. After eating, Nsuta put away the food wraps while Chirabo washed the plates behind the kitchen. Then Chirabo sat down and waited. Where did we stop yesterday? Nsuta asked. Nsuta is the witch. When women were prohibited from grabbing land and animals. Oh, yes. That was because the ancients had told another story that women were not of land. Women not of land? How? Well, ancients saw the universe as divided into 4 realms. Bring me the pencil on top of the bookshelf. Nsota pointed above Chirabo's head towards the bookshelf. And the blue exercise book, I'll show you. She opened the exercise book to a fresh page, placed it on the floor, and drew a compass. The first realm was heaven. She wrote heaven where north would be on the compass. Then underworld, she placed it on the south point. And then the sea, she placed it on the west point. And finally, land, she placed it on the east point of the compass. Now, that is the ancient compass. Chirabo stared at the compass. She was tempted to say, you really are not blind, Nsota, but she swallowed it. Now, heaven was the world of the gods, yes? Yes. The underworld is where the dead begin a new life, yes? Yes. And if land belonged to man, what is left? The sea. Aha. The sea, the ancients claimed, was women's realm. What? Women belonged in water? And if they did, they could not share in land wealth, could they? If you want property, they told women ancients, go back to the sea and grab it to your heart's content. Yeah, even when they saw baby girls born the same way as boys. Well, they claimed that the very first woman rose out of the sea, while the first man emerged from earth. But that's not true. Nambi was Gulu's daughter. She came from heaven. Well, Gulu was her father, but who was her mother? Well, she did not have a mother, only a father and brothers. That's Chirabo. See, they found a hole in their first story of Chinton and Nambi and filled it. Nambi got a mother, a woman who apparently rose from the sea. Her name was Namazi. In fact, Namazi was said to have brought all water bodies on land. I've never heard of her because the story was buried. When Chirabo did not respond, Nsota carried on. Apparently, Namazi was so magnificent that when Gulu saw her, he was mesmerized. She gave him a lot of sons, including Walumbe, the bringer of death, and Kaikuzi, the borrower, but only one daughter, Nambi. Then one day, after years and years of being together, Namazi, without provocation, without explanation, got up and went back to the sea. She never came back. Gulu was so heartbroken, he never remarried. He brought up his children on his own. So If the first woman came from the sea and returned to it, women belonged there. I like Namazi. I like that I came out of her. Now, focus Chirabo. She's a story which aggravated our situation. They used her to link our original state to the sea. You do not realize, but ancients had such an irrational fear of the nature of women, they would try anything to keep them under control. They supported this story by pointing to the sea. Apparently, both women and the sea were baffling, changeful. Today they're this, tomorrow they're that. I'll stop there for the time being.
Oh, that's really beautiful, Jennifer. Thank you for sharing that with us. That moment you read is one of my favorite moments in the book, where you see Unsuta's relationship with Chirabo kind of blossom, and when you're able to witness this powerful Socratic exchange where Unsuta is carefully, intentionally taking her through really huge questions about feminism and patriarchy, but through stories. That's kind of what I would like us to maybe start with, is that one of the things that come out of that conversation is that patriarchy constitutes itself through storytelling, right? Mm-hmm. And that, you tell these stories, you enshrine them in mythology and creation myths, and all of a sudden it justifies all kinds of oppression. Can you talk a little bit about this oppression by storytelling? Like, just tell us more about how storytelling comes to be a way to actually keep humanity down.
It is interesting how important storytelling is to culture, to installing culture, to creating personalities, even including family histories, family stories, but also our personalities themselves. We do that through storytelling. And it is surprising that wherever you go, you're going to find these stories, you're going to find these myths constructed. So I was pretty surprised when I came to Britain and I found out that they had this myth that a woman loses part of her brain cells with every child they give birth to. I was like, what? The Africans missed out on that. Or even the recent myth that women cannot park cars, you have to use stories and repeat them over and over. And for people to listen to them, but also to internalize them. This is the power of storytelling. Even in this story, you find out that as these stories are repeated over and over, women internalize them. And therefore then the patriarchy does not have to work hard anymore. Women have believed these stories and they are doing the oppression themselves. So that way, the patriarchy can sit back and cross its legs and say, that's done. And look at any form of oppression, whether it's colonization, the way they made people that were colonized believe that they were inferior, that they were not capable of looking after themselves. It's the same way that the patriarchy did to the women. And it's interesting how something as that seems so unthreatening as storytelling can be such a powerful tool of oppression.
Yeah, that's powerful. I mean, your point about how we come to internalize oppression, right, where we begin to self-regulate ourselves, is functions in part through these entrenched stories. And there are two words that kept coming up in the novel, shrinking and squeezing, right? Yeah. Because Chirabo felt as if, there was something being squeezed in her, or rather that the idea of femininity offered to her by her grandmother felt like it was squeezing her into this body, right? And at some point, Unsuta kept saying, over time, women have had to shrink themselves so that the first woman, this ancient wild power that exists in them, can be contained.
Yes.
Can you maybe reflect on that a bit? Like, who is the first woman? What is this original state that Chirabo sort of found herself being connected to?
Well, again, let's go back to storytelling, of course, because Nsuta is using storytelling herself because she knows it's the same tool that is going to set women free. Okay. Now, Nsuta obviously does not believe there is a first woman in Chirabo, but she believes there's a rebel in Chirabo. She believes there's a girl in there that does not want to be treated different from boys. And this is the squeezing that she feels. But you cannot explain feminism to a 12-year-old girl in rural Uganda 1975. So basically what you do then is to pick on stories and say, the first woman, because that is a major figure in all cultures. There is always a first woman, and she's revered, and she tends to be worshipped. Okay. And so to hang on to that and say, but she's in you, how lucky, you know. You know, that in a way, Suta is putting a seed in the little girl. And actually, as it carries on, it grows. And when Chirabo gets older, of course, she abandons the idea of the first woman. But there's that sense in her that there was a time when women were bold, they were tall, they were big, they were wild, they were independent. And there were all of these things. And if they were once like that, it's like we would say the software is still there.
Right.
Just need to activate it.
Absolutely. You know, that there's still something in every woman that embodies those ideals. And I think that that's what becomes clear as the story goes on. You realize that the original state, or the first woman, is really universally in every woman, right? Yes. It's just a matter of how does your specific historical circumstance make it possible for you to nurture that thing, or kind of, you know, tame it and make it this thing that patriarchy can understand. So one thing that struck me in Chirabo's life, you know, is that so she's living in 70s Uganda.
Yes.
And that's a very specific moment in the history of the nation. I mean, what did you go through to create that fictional universe? Because we are in the 70s, and then at some point we are taken to the 1930s. And we get this really, I think, absolutely rare perspective on Ugandan culture to look at history through schoolgirls going to school in the 1930s and in the 70s. I mean, how did you kind of put that historical world together?
Well, in the beginning, I worked mainly from Chirabo's point of view, and I focused mainly on the 70s. Okay. Now, luckily, Chirabo is probably 4 or 5 years older than me.
Okay.
So I have a little bit of access to the 70s, but I also have more knowledge, because you know what? We don't normally see the first decade of our lives. However, I have it in my parents and that generation, because they keep visiting it, they keep talking about it, and so I have heard a lot about it. But you know, we also record a lot of our history in music and in saying. So I had access to all of that. But you know, while writing the story, I realized that Nsuta, the witch, and Chirabu's grandmother were such forceful characters that Chirabu was not enough to carry them through the novel.
Mm.
So, though it's a third person narrating, you still see the world from Chirabu's point of view.
Right.
But I came to a point where I hit the wall, and Chirabu could not carry her grandmother's story, Nsuta's story. And I thought, okay, these women are asking for much more. There's no way I am not going to explain why they are where they are now and why Chirabo is sitting in the middle of these two women and each one is tugging, pulling one arm to literally one arm here and one arm there. So I just had to go back to the 1930s. And for that, I did a lot of research in, especially with education, but I also talked to my mother about the world that she was born in, because she was born in the 40s.
I
But,
see.
but like me having access to the 70s and the 30s, my mom had access to them.
I
She's
see. Interesting.
Yeah, she's one of the storytellers in her family. She's the historian in her family. And much of that history of that region, I gleaned from her and her older brother. But of course, I did research in books to find out the rest of it. And I used many of her relatives. Thankfully, she does not read English because I perverted. uh, but it was such an experience talking to her and listening to her. My mom had probably up to 10 years in education. But my goodness, she's a library.
Wow.
Yeah. And I didn't even know. All I knew was that when she starts to tell stories, we are all in stitches, But I didn't know that she had such history until I took her back to her village and they started talking. And everybody joined in and they said, "You didn't know? When we need history about this village, we just ring your mom." So that's how I managed to get Nsuta's childhood and grandmother, and then see them through their teenage. But it was such a pleasure.
Yeah.
Going back and finding those women and finding their lives and finding their loves and their worries and their struggles. It was a fantastic time for me doing that research.
Wow. I mean, I have a lot of questions to ask you about the women in this world. We'll get to that. But just you mentioned, it was fun to kind of explore that world. I have read Chintu.
Yes.
When I started reading this, I was like, Jennifer had a ton of fun writing this book. It's just the texture is different. Chintu is this kind of dark, deliciously dark, heavy, stark world. This one is airy and it's open and it's freeing. It just seemed like a book that you wrote from a different kind of place. Can you tell us a bit about just where this book came from?
Okay. Chintu was a very serious book, but I also wrote it from the major myth of the first man. And therefore, the first man in Buganda is a major figure. You mentioned Chintu, so much comes along, for Ugandans. So I was aware of what I was doing and it carried a lot of weight with it. Okay. And I was always worried I must get this myth right, even though it was entirely interpretive, but I had to get it right, so that when Ugandans read it, they're like, okay, this is an interpretation, but it makes sense.
Right.
But when it came to my second novel, I knew that I was going to write a feminist novel because Chintu had turned out masculinist for me. Yeah, 6 main characters and 5 of them were male. But also that myth, Chintu, is very masculine, you know. But in this one, I thought, okay, I am going to play around with oral traditions, but I'm going to take the ones that are interpretive. Okay. The ones which I suspect were told by women who are saying something else rather than what the story is doing. And that is when I think the book started to become a little bit relaxed, you know, because it was, can you believe this? Do you see what they are doing here? And though you know, it's a witch taking this child, walking her through this major interpretation, but it's me taking the reader, you know, and I'm hoping that the reader can do the interpretation themselves. So, and because I had it for a very long time, I kept on going back and saying, can I do this? Because there were things that I thought, no, you can't write about that.
Like what?
But as I grew bolder, I kept on saying, yeah, I'm going to do it. Yes, I'm going to do that. I wasn't so worried about how will people read this. Okay. You know, I was prepared to shock the Ugandans. So I think that came through.
Okay. How did you shock them? What do you think would have been shocking for a Ugandan reader?
The women, the way I took apart the woman's body, literally, and just put it there, have a look.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely.
Ugandans would be like, these are our things, you know, we talk about them amongst ourselves. You can't. But again, when it came out, I think everybody thought, but it's about time we started to talk about things like this.
Yeah, you're right. And I'm going to try my best for us to get there, because there are this just really stunning moment where the woman's body is kind of rethought, you know? And I'm going to try our best to have us get there, because these are key moments in Chirabo's coming of age, where she essentially has to rethink what the terms of value for her body is. And it's absolutely powerful. But before we get there, I wanted us to talk about the women in this story. Yes. This is a novel about women. I mean, I love it. It's like women are everywhere. And there are all kinds of women.
Yes.
And they're like older women and girls. Like, I've never seen an African novel that just completely just populates a world with women in all their diversity. But one thing that I noticed that you do is that you make it virtually impossible for any woman to be typecast into a villain. And trust me, these women are not all good. They are all flawed. They are all complex. You love some you're just like, oh, I can't stand you. But what you cannot do is reduce them to a certain kind of villainy. So like why was it important to you to kind of have us think of women in this types of beyond binaries?
The first thing was that as a child, I just did not understand the books I was reading, especially books that came from the West, where women were really, really good and some were really, really bad. And I had never met them. And they used to drive me crazy, you know, Jane Eyre.
Yeah.
And then you had Emma, you know, from Jane Austen's Emma. And like, but where are the women like the women I see on the village? So, of course, when I started writing, I decided I'm going to write people I know. They are lifelike. They are no one. I have not met anybody who is entirely bad without a redeeming. No, and probably also it's the culture that I grew up in. You know, people would say Idi Amin was A, B, C, D, Z, but when they come to X, they'll say, but he also did this, and he also did that, and he did that. But throughout the alphabet, 3/4 of the alphabet, he was a bad person.
Right.
But the last quarter, they would tell you a few good things about him. And for me, that is humanity. You know, that's who we relate to. And therefore, and one of the things that probably drove me here was the woman whom you meet in literature, and she's wonderful, and she's married, and she's good, and she's being mistreated by a husband or in marriage or whatever, and she doesn't fight back. The women I know, they are funny. Something is happening here, but they are doing something behind, you know, and they would tell you, that's how I have my release. That's how I get my, you know. But I hadn't met a woman who's just suffering without fighting back. Maybe it's an African thing. I don't know. And so when I started writing, I wrote the women I know, but also the women I look up to, the women that interest me, you know. And these women are, you know, I find an aspect here and I find an aspect there. You know, I know somebody who has an aspect, but I've read about this aspect or I've heard about that, and I bring those together and create a character. And often as characters start to emerge, they are therefore easy to see, she would do this. No, she wouldn't do that. So Auntie Abby, you know, she is a proper Ugandan woman. We know a lot of those women, you know. At the same time, is Auntie Nsanji, you know, her father's, her grandfather's sister. She's also a type. They are there, they are wonderful, and they are our relatives. And for me, they're as valid as Nsuta, as Chirabo, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and they lend a certain kind of layer to the feminist conversation, you know, so that everybody cannot be Unsuta, who they are just ready to bring down the patriarchy in this kind of revolutionary militant way. You know, we need people like that, but then there are just all kinds of different ways of existing, you know, within the context that we're talking about.
Yeah, and indeed, I wanted to point out, because Western feminism came with revolution, with it's written, it has theory, it has icons, and the world then imagined that there were no feminists around the world. But actually, if you look at life, every woman resists, but we all resist according to our natures, according to what we can manage, and to our personalities. Okay. Auntie Abby was resisting in her own way, because you know what? She kneels, she does this for the husband, and then she turns around and said, men are like children, you have to do it. You know, so you just cannot go with a particular kind of woman, because then those other women are left behind.
Yeah.
Because for them, resisting is life. It's nothing to write home about. You know, today they fight and push back. Tomorrow they realize, in order to survive, I need to take a step back. You know, that is all resistance, and it is valid.
It is valid. Yeah, there's that moment where Chirabo tells Unsuta towards the end, all women resist. You know, that, so to imagine that there is this world of the militants and, you know, the foot soldiers of patriarchy who don't do anything, is to, I mean, of course, we want to acknowledge this range, but it's to do the patriarchal thing of reducing people to one thing and then excluding them out of the conversation.
That is fantastically put. I couldn't put it any better. Indeed, it's a very patriarchal aspect or way of classifying people.
Right, right. So, since we are on the question of feminism, I want to talk about two words that come up in the novel. You use language in this really precise way. And in many cases, like you're using words in such a nuanced way that a word is doing so much, and there were two words that came up. I'm going to mispronounce it, but let me try. And, umwekanonkano.
Yes.
And Kweluma. Can you tell me how to pronounce it first before you explain to us what those words are?
You got them right. One is Mwenkanonkano and the other is Kweluma.
Kweluma, okay.
Yes. So Mwenkanonkano is a word that actually the patriarch came up with. The patriarch came up with, this, and it was the idea of being equal.
Okay.
And they didn't realize that women would actually pick up on it and use it as a powerful term, But that is the indigenous term for feminism.
Okay.
And
what language is that?
That's Luganda.
Luganda, okay.
Yeah. And all it says, we want equality. Okay. Nothing else, just equality, But Kweluma is to bite, But Kweluma is to bite yourself. And in when we were children, whenever we fought amongst ourselves, parents would say, "Oh, the children are biting themselves. Oh, children are Kwelumaluma." That's when you turn on each other. But it for me, it was a very useful term to explain what oppression does to a person. And it doesn't matter what kind of oppression it is. Once you internalize your inferiority, your life becomes less than the oppressors. Yeah. But also the oppressor is far away. You can't touch them the same way the colonizers, the slavers were. So often you'll find that people who are oppressed find it easy to turn on each other. Because after all, the other one's life is also not is as worthless as yours. So it's easier for a woman to turn against a woman than it was to turn against a man. Okay? And often women turned on each other to impress men. But that is the nature of oppression. It is in such a way that when you're oppressed, there's this power and pressure that is pushed on you, okay? And the best way to get rid of it is to fight back, okay? But when you can't fight back, you have to release that pent-up emotion. And either you turn it on your body and you self-mutilate, or you turn on people similar to yourself.
Interesting.
So this is what I called Kweluma. And I thought that if you understand the nature of Kweluma, then it's very easy for women to get together, or oppressed people to say, aha, this is a moment that we are turning on each other. It's not us. It's
right.
them.
It's them. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And for you, is this a kind of, is Umwekanonkano a kind of African feminist thought, or is there something, is it different from feminist as it is imagined in a Western tradition?
For me, Mwenkanonkano is indigenous thought. This is thought that comes from the traditions. It's you glean it from the oral traditions, which are not touched by Europe,
right?
Yet. Okay, so if you look in the oral traditions, the folk tales, all those stories, you'll find stories that women wrote, but they are coded. And you have to decode them to find out what they're saying. So therefore, this feminism is indigenous. And what I'm trying to say is that there was feminist thought before Western feminism arrived. And this is why the story is set in 1975. Because in 1975 is the moment that Western feminism arrives in Uganda in a big way. Because of that, Mexico, 1975, the Women's Conference. For the first time, the conference was put on radio, it was put on TV, and women saw women marching and listened to what they were saying. And there were women who were sent from Uganda to attend the conference. So it was very, very important for me to show Nsuta, who is a traditional or who is an indigenous feminist, listen to this conference and compare it to what she knows as an African woman and how that feminism that is coming, therefore, is going to affect or how useful it will be in Uganda. You know, it's very, very important because at the moment we have African feminism. And probably we have Ugandan feminism. But often we take the Western model and then try to make it fit us, fit our culture. But I feel that wherever women were oppressed, there was a reaction to that oppression. There was feminist thought. And therefore, that feminist thought is it's quite unique to that culture because women were not oppressed similarly around the world. So in the West, women were not allowed to vote. We never had.
Right, that's interesting because our nations appeared later. So we entered into politics being able to vote.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
So the way African women, and even within Uganda, you will find that a certain community, they have issues with this, but another one doesn't. So my message was, for all of us for whom this feminism didn't come naturally out of our worlds, we need to go back and look at our ancient texts. Because those women, wherever you are, those women must have left behind some texts. We just have to look for them and decode them.
That's wonderful. So we have about 5 minutes left to chat. So we won't be having time to do the second reading. But when our 5 minutes is done, I will also invite you to say a few more words. Okay. So the last question, I have for you is towards the end of the story, Nsuta and Chirabod, they are back together again. And I love the symmetry of that kind of opening and closing. And Nsuta says to her, telling origin stories is an act of resistance, right? So now we've moved from a certain kind of patriarchal storytelling, and she's saying, look, but we have to continue the storytelling work because it's part of how we resist, right? So what do you mean by that, in the sense that how, as part of the feminist project, do we use stories to resist?
We need new myth. We've grown up with Eve bringing the curse to humanity. I grew up with Nambi being the sister of death. Wherever you go, you have this feminine guilt. We need to change that because the reality is myth making is not going to go away.
Right.
We can't turn around and say, oh, get rid of myth. Myths have been unkind to us. No, we need to debunk those myths, but we need to create our own.
Okay.
And indeed, Chinsuta in that story creates a few myths. So, for example, Namazi is not a character from our mythology, but she came up with that. It suited her. But we need to create our own myth that suit us, that suit our intentions, that create what we want to be. Because in reality, you can't walk away from myth making, at individual level, at national level, at racial levels, at every level you get to. People, companies, nations, races are mythologizing themselves. Yeah. And this is what we need to do. We just cannot stop storytelling as women. We need to sit down with our daughters and tell stories. So, for example, in my family, we have this myth that that all the girls are very intelligent and fighters and the boys are not. I don't know who came up with that. But every time we go to our cemetery, because we tend to have families or cemeteries that run in clans, we have a woman that was my great-grandfather's sister. And we are told that she lived in the 1800s and she had women. They are called bazana, but only men have bazana because they tend to be wives.
Interesting.
Very interesting. And she used to marry men and then kick them out. And her name was Victoria Nancha, but every person, that name has been reborn over and over and over. So one of my sister is also Nancha, Victoria. But once you're given that name, people say, oh my days, that one is going to be this. And people turn out like that because that name carries that myth. Yeah. But also, up to my generation, we really believe that girls are go-getters.
Wow.
But that is a myth. I don't know who came up with it because I know my brothers are intelligent, but when we get together, it's us girls. Okay, yeah. What do we do? Yeah, but that is the kind of myth that I suspect one of my greats came up with, and she wouldn't call herself a feminist, but she did, and it runs in the family, and I'm not about to stop it.
Right. That's wonderful. What you said, we need to make new myths. That's really powerful. And I think that gets to the heart of storytelling as a space of freedom and resistance, yes. Which in many ways speaks to the fact that today we are celebrating the emancipation of enslaved Americans. So the importance of storytelling to that history is something that we definitely want to hold on to. Oh, Jennifer, thank you very much for being with us. Do you have any closing remarks?
Oh, yes. Thank you for having me to this festival. I was so looking forward to it. And thank you for accepting to host me. And those were fantastic questions. I hope one day I meet you at a festival.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Now, coming up next on the Langston Hughes virtual stage at 4:30 p.m. is a conversation with Hanif Abdurakib and Donnie Walton discussing the feature book, A Little Devil in America, Notes in Praise of Black Performance. Do stick around to take a look. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
My name is Sarah Das, author of Where the Rhythm Takes You, a young adult contemporary retelling of Jane Austen's Persuasion set in the Caribbean, more specifically set in Trinidad and Tobago. In the novel, 17-year-old Raina gets a second chance at first love when her ex-boyfriend Aiden returns after a couple years abroad, during which he's become a famous musician. But now he's back, and he's staying at the seaside resort that Raina's family owns and where she works. They spend time together, and of course, old feelings reignite. Today, I'm going to be reading for you from page 44. This is Aiden and Raina's first meeting. They're still kids at this point, about 11 years old. I walked down the street to the house. The music seemed to be coming from the backyard, so I plunged through the brush, skated down the sloping land, and stumbled into a hidden clearing behind the house. The grandson was there, sawing through a plank of wood. He had it balanced on top of a makeshift work table, which he'd fashioned out of an old door and 2 overturned garbage bins. 3 cement blocks were propped next to the back steps of the house. The boy had jet black hair, shaved so short beads of sweat glistened on his scalp. His brow furrowed with concentration. His feet were bare and muddy. He was tall, even back then, his limbs long and knobby, yet despite the awkward angles that defined his body, he moved with a surprising level of skill. I noticed he acted older than he looked. Later, I'd learned he'd had to, taking care of himself while his mom worked long hours as a nurse. It was only recently his mom and his grandfather reconnected, the old man agreeing to take Aiden for the holidays so Aiden wouldn't be home alone all day. The boy looked up, saw me, and startled. "Hi!" I said loudly. I didn't know if he heard me over the music. "My name's Raina. I'm supposed to come over here to meet you and bring you a gift. You're Mr. Chandra's grandson, right?" He didn't answer, retreating to the parked truck under the house. All the while, he kept shooting me looks like he couldn't believe I was there. That made both of us. "That was a stupid question," I continued, raising my voice. "Of course you're his grandson. Why else would you be here in his yard? If you weren't his grandson, this would be creepy." The radio cut off a second before the end of my sentence. We stared at each other in a sudden silence. He shut the truck door and walked over to me, his brows raised with surprise. I gripped the box, half tempted to run off with it, stash it, then sneak it into my room when Mommy wasn't looking. But who was I kidding? She'd know. She knew everything. "Did you hear anything I just said?" I asked. "Just the last part where you called me creepy." "That's not..." I fumbled for words, embarrassed. "You didn't hear the whole thing. I was saying you were not creepy." Still seems like a weird way to say hello to a stranger. "No, I swear I didn't mean anything." Something had gone very wrong with this conversation. I broke off when he started laughing. He was messing with me. I'd never met anyone with the ability to piss me off faster. Not before then, and not since. To me,